You're looking at a family photo taken on a summer day in 1906. A normal family, smiling happy. Or at least, that's what the eye sees. But if you look closely, you'll see something strange. A little boy, Thomas Whitmore, holding a small metal object in his hand. A bullet. Why would a child keep something like that? In his family photo, Thomas was not just any boy. He knew a dark secret, a plot that even adults didn't realize. He did the unthinkable to save his family. And he did it all in silence, leaving only a hidden message in the very photo you're looking at. In today's video, we follow Sarah Chen, who spent 6 months searching for the truth to uncover the story of Thomas Whitmore, a boy who knew tragedy and was brave in ways no one could have imagined. A light spring rain pattered against the windows of the restoration room at the Connecticut Historical Society. Sarah Chen carefully adjusted the LED magnifying lamp on her desk. Her eyes fixed on another photograph from the Whitmore Estate collection. It was April 2024, and she had spent the past week restoring damaged family photos. This one arrived with very little information, just a handwritten note on the back, "The Whitmore Family. June 19, 1906, Hartford." The image showed 7 people arranged in a garden with a stately Victorian house in the background. All were smiling, dressed in their finest. At first glance, the photo seemed like a symbol of prosperity and happiness in early 20th century America. Sarah had restored hundreds of old photos in her 12 years of work. But this time, something made her stop. She couldn't immediately make out perhaps the forced smiles or the sneaky tension in some of the people's poses, despite the formal arrangement of the photo. She began the digitization process, scanning the photo at 4800 dpi. Enough resolution to reveal every tiny detail invisible to the naked eye. As the image appeared on the screen, Sarah zoomed in on each section, examining every line, every damage that needed digital restoration. In the middle was Robert Whitmore, a stern father in his 50s with a thick mustache wearing a dark suit. Beside him was his wife Helen, elegant in a high-necked dress with intricate lace detailing. The 3 adult children stood behind, while the 2 younger children sat cross-legged in front. Sarah focused on the children. The girl was about 5, wearing a white dress with a ribbon in her hair. The boy, about 8, sat upright, his hands neatly placed in his lap. As she zoomed in on their faces to recreate the details, Sarah's eyes fell on something unusual. Between the boy's fingers, a small metal object peeked out, partially hidden by the way he held his hand. Sarah held her breath. She zoomed in, further adjusting the contrast and sharpness. The object was clear, a cylinder with a rounded tip. A bullet. A child no older than 8, holding a bullet in a formal family portrait. Sarah's heart pounded. Why would a child have a real bullet in a family photo? Was it a toy? No. The metallic sheen and size were spot on, not fake. She opened her notebook, wrote down the date, June 19th, 1906. Then she opened the historical newspaper database on her computer. If there was anything unusual about the Whitmores, there would be traces in the newspapers. What she found made her blood run cold. Sarah's hand shook slightly as she flipped through the digitized pages of the Hartford Courant, June 1906. She knew that over the years, tragedies always left a paper trail, no matter how hard wealthy families tried to bury them. On June 23rd, just 4 days after the photo, the headline ran across the front page: Tragedy strikes. Prominent Hartford family. 2. Killed at Whitmore home. Sarah leaned closer to the screen. The article, in its formal, calm language, typical of the early 20th century, was clear enough. Robert Whitmore, 53, and his eldest son James, Whitmore, 28, were found dead in their home on the morning of June 22nd. The details were vague. The article referred only to a tragic family incident and asked for privacy. The police would only say the case had been investigated and satisfactorily resolved. Sarah frowned. Such language was often a sign of a cover-up, especially in wealthy families. She searched the next few articles, finding only brief mentions. One article mentioned a private funeral. Another, dated July 5th, announced that the Whitmore estate had been sold and the family had moved to pursue new opportunities. Sarah opened a new search window, typing in each family member's name. Helen Whitmore appeared in the 1910 New York census, living with her daughter in Brooklyn. The other adult children were scattered California, Massachusetts. But there was no trace of the two children in the photo. Sarah pulled up the original photo again, zooming in on the boy's face. His eyes were no longer innocent, but held a deep knowingness, a haunting that an 8-year-old boy should not have. She looked at the bullet again, noticing how carefully he had hidden it, but still made it visible in the photo. It was no accident. The boy wanted someone to recognize him, even if it took more than a century. The clock read nearly 6 p.m. The gallery was about to close. Sarah saved all the research materials, made copies of the restored photos, especially the detail of the boy's hands with the hidden bullet. As she packed her things, she still felt that the boy had tried to tell a story that no one had ever heard until today. And you who are listening to this story are wondering, what did that boy go through? And what did that bullet really signify in the Whitmore family? The photograph was more than a family portrait. It was evidence. But evidence for what Sarah needed to know: who the boy was, what had happened in that house, and why he had a bullet hidden in his hand during what should have been a joyous moment. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the Historical Society early. A large mug of coffee in hand, her heart filled with determination. She had barely slept the image of the boy and the bullet swirling around in her head all night. She headed straight for the genealogical section, a quiet corner filled with census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and death certificates. Ordinary letters became strange and remarkable when examined closely. Starting with the 1900 census, Sarah found the Whitmore family living at 247 Asylum Street, Hartford, a posh address in the city's most prosperous neighborhood. Robert Whitmore was listed as a manufacturer with considerable wealth. His wife, Helen, was 38. The children were listed by age: James, 22, William, 20, Catherine, 18, Thomas, 2, and Emily, an infant. Sarah paused. Thomas would have turned 8 in 1906, the same age as the boy in the photograph. Emily also looked younger in the photograph than she actually was, about 6. These two young children could have been the result of a second round of births after Robert and Helen thought they were done having children. She continued with the 1910 census, curious to know what had happened to the family after the tragedy. Helen lived in Brooklyn with her daughter Catherine and her husband. William was listed as living in San Francisco, working as a clerk. James had died as reported. But Thomas and Emily were nowhere to be found. Sarah expanded her search: state census records, school records, orphanage lists. Finally, Emily appeared in the 1908 school records in Boston, living with the William family. Perhaps she had been sent away after the tragedy to protect her from what had happened. Thomas, still invisible. She looked at the death records, her stomach knotting with worry. Thomas Whitmore was listed in the Connecticut Death Register, died March 15, 1914 in New Haven, age 16. Cause: accidental drowning. Age 16, lived only 8 years after the photo died, just shy of adulthood. Sarah sat silently trying to process the information. The child who had hidden the bullet in her hand for the family photo had died at age 16 under circumstances deemed accidental. But Sarah knew to be skeptical of convenient explanations, especially when it came to traumatized children and family tragedies. She opened the New Haven newspaper archives from March 1914 and found a short obituary. Thomas had been a student at Hopkins Grammar School, drowned in the Mill River. The article described him as a quiet, studious boy who would be remembered by his teachers and classmates. There was no mention of the 1906 tragedy or the famous Whitmore name. Sarah printed out all the files, made a timeline in her notebook. Something terrible had happened in the Whitmore house on June 22nd, 1906. 2 men died. Families fell apart. And a boy trying to leave a trace in a photograph died just 8 years later. She needed to know what Thomas knew and why he felt compelled to hide the bullet in a way that someone might later discover. During her lunch break, Sarah strolled through historic Hartford, finally stopping in front of a beautiful stone church on Main Street. The sign read, First Church of Christ, established 1632. If the Whitmores were prominent members of Hartford society, they would have attended one of these old churches, one that kept careful records. She entered the cool, quiet space and asked to see the church historian. Reverend Patricia Morrison appeared a few minutes later. A woman in her 60s with gentle eyes and a clear passion for preserving history. As Sarah explained her research, Patricia's face lit up with interest. The Whitmores were members here, Patricia confirmed, leading Sarah to a small archive room behind the church office. I remember seeing their names in the old books. Let me get the records from that period. The membership book showed the family was active. Robert served on the building committee. Helen organized charity events. The children attended Sunday school. But there was a note dated June 30th, 1906. The Whitmores had asked to be terminated just 8 days after the tragedy. Patricia also produced a leather-bound diary from the pastor from 1905 to 1908. Reverend Samuel Matthews often recorded personal thoughts about parishioners, she explained. Not an official record, just a private note. Sarah carefully turned the pages to the notes from June 1906. The 24th, 2 days after the death. I visited the Whitmores today to express my condolences after the terrible events. Mrs. Whitmore was inconsolable, but I sensed something else in her eyes. Perhaps relief or gratitude. She did not speak of what had happened, only that God had protected the innocent. Her daughter Catherine told me that Thomas had not spoken a word since that night. Any words? The boy sat silently in the room, his eyes vacant, his hands clutching a small metal object that no one could get him to let go. I tried to pray with you, but you just turned your face to the wall. That was the last entry in Pastor Matthews's diary. Sarah's heart was pounding. a metal object, right after the tragedy. Probably the bullet Thomas had hidden in the photograph just 3 days before everything fell apart. She read on. A week later, the pastor added another entry. Mrs. Whitmore came to see me privately. She asked if a child could be forgiven for keeping a secret that could have prevented suffering. I told her that children are never responsible for the mistakes of adults. She burst into tears and said, He knew, and he tried to warn us the only way he could. But we didn't understand. Sarah sat motionless. The pieces began to fit together. Thomas had known something before the tragedy. He had tried to send a message of warning, but no one heard. No one understood. Patricia put a hand on her shoulder. Are you okay? You look pale. Sarah looked up, her voice trembling slightly. I think that boy tried to stop something terrible from happening. And maybe he lived the rest of his life in silence, blaming himself for not doing enough. But what had driven Robert Whitmore, a powerful and wealthy man, to such a depth of despair? Sarah knew family tragedies often began with money. 2 days later, she pored over old files in the Connecticut State Library. Business papers, lawsuits, court records. Each piece of the puzzle revealed a grim picture. Robert Whitmore owned Whitmore, manufacturing a textile company with 3 factories around Hartford. At the turn of the 20th century, it had been a beacon of prosperity, employing more than 400 workers and supplying cloth to all of New England. But after 1904, signs of trouble began to emerge. Southern mills were competing with cheap, labor-major customers were leaving, and profits were plummeting. By 1905, Robert was making desperate decisions, mortgaging both his mill and his personal property to borrow money, delaying paychecks, and forcing workers to strike in March 1906. And worse, he was under investigation for falsifying financial records to get more bank loans. By June 1906, Robert was on the brink. The bank was about to foreclose on the mill. The government was about to charge him with fraud. He was about to lose everything: his job, his reputation, his freedom. Sarah found a remarkable document, a letter from Robert's personal lawyer, dated June 15th, 1906, just 4 days before the photograph was taken. I must advise you to stop on your current path or face criminal prosecution. However, there is an alternative, a way to protect your family from the consequences. I will come by on June 18 to discuss it privately. June 18, just 1 day before the photo shoot. Sarah stared at the words, her mind reeling. What was that alternative? Could it be so dark that an 8-year-old had stumbled upon it and tried to leave a trace? She turned to Robert's life insurance records in his will. He had taken out a policy for $50,000, a huge sum in 1906, just 3 months before his death. The beneficiary, Helen Whitmore. The insurance did not cover suicide, but paid out in full if it was an accident or murder. If Robert died from James's shooting, as the press had suggested, Helen would receive the entire amount. And indeed, according to the inheritance records, Helen not only did not become poor, but also financially stable after the tragedy. The insurance money, combined with the sale of the house and property, was enough for her and her children to live comfortably. But the question remained unanswered. Why did Thomas hold the bullet? What did he know that the adults did not? Sarah decided to search for personal records, Letters, diaries, anything that reflected life inside that house in its final days. Surprisingly, finding the Whitmore descendants was easier than she thought. A week after posting the notice on the genealogy forum, Sarah received a response from Jennifer Davis, who introduced herself as Emily Whitmore's great-granddaughter, the youngest girl in the photo. They arranged to meet on Saturday afternoon in a small coffee shop in Hartford. Jennifer was in her early 40s, a high school teacher. Bright eyes, a soft voice, but full of curiosity. "I grew up with whispers of a tragedy in 1906, she said, stirring her coffee. But my grandmother Emily's daughter never wanted to talk about it. She always said, let the past be. When she died, I inherited an old box filled with letters papers. I haven't dared to read them all." Sarah almost held her breath. "Can you show them to me?" Jennifer smiled, pulling out her phone. "Actually, I brought a few copies here. I was going through them last night, intrigued by your email." She handed Sarah a stack of photocopied letters, all written by Emily, spanning from 1920 to 1960. Some were addressed to her daughter, but a few were never sent written to Thomas. Sarah trembled as she read the first, dated 1925. "Dear Thomas, today I am 25 older than you were when you left us. It has been 11 years, but I still think of you every day. I wish you had told someone about your discovery. You shouldn't have had to bear it alone. You were only a child. It wasn't your responsibility to save us." Another letter from 1930. "I sometimes dream of you, Thomas. In it, you were 8 years old, sitting in the garden with the bullet in your hand. I used to ask you why you kept it, and you said, 'It's proof.' I didn't understand then, but now I know. You found your father's gun, and you understood what he was up to. You took the bullets, didn't you? You thought if the gun was empty, nothing bad would happen. But you couldn't take them, all afraid he would find out. I'll just keep one, so that someone will know the truth later." Sarah held her breath, her whole body cold. Her worst fears seemed to be taking shape. The third letter from 1945 was heartbreakingly cold. "Mother told me before she died about that night. Father intended to kill us all. Mother, James, William, Catherine, you and me. He couldn't bear the humiliation. When the business failed, when the fraud was exposed, he chose to end it all. But when he pulled the trigger the first time, it didn't go off. The second time, still silence. He looked at the gun confused. And that's when James realized. They struggled, and then both died." Sarah dropped the paper tears, blurring her vision. That 8-year-old boy, Thomas Whitmore, had discovered the plan to kill his family. In his fear, he quietly crept into his father's study and removed most of the bullets from the gun. He kept one, marked it as proof, and hid it in a family photograph, a silent cry for help to the future. But no one understood. Until more than a century later. The last letter Sarah read was from 1958. "Thank you, Thomas. If you hadn't removed those bullets, Mother would have been the first victim, and we all of us would have followed. But you never forgave yourself, did you? You carried that burden until it destroyed you. That drowning was no accident, New Haven. I know, even though everyone else believes it. You can't live with what you know, what you did. You're brave, but broken. I hope you find peace in the end." Sarah needs to understand that Thomas wasn't just a child in tragedy, but a real person with his own thoughts, feelings, and pain. She contacted Hopkins Grammar School in New Haven, where Thomas had attended from 1912 until his death in 1914. Harold Price, the archivist, an old man with kind eyes and an office full of leather-bound books and old student photos, ushered Sarah in. "Thomas Whitmore, that's right," he murmured, running his finger along the attendance book from 1912. He entered in September 1912. He was 14, a little older than his classmates. Records show he had been homeschooled for the previous 2 years. Sarah understood. After the tragedy of 1906, Thomas had been too devastated to return to regular school. His mother kept him home, hoping time would heal the pain. Harold pulled out Thomas's school records. He was an excellent student with near-perfect grades. Teachers noted that he was remarkably mature for his age, but also very isolated, not playing with his classmates. A 1913 evaluation read, "Thomas was brilliant, but haunted." He participated in discussions with a depth beyond his years, especially in literature and history, but he seemed to carry a deep sadness. When reading Hamlet, he wrote an essay about the burden of knowledge and the paralysis of knowing something terrible and not being able to prevent it. The essay was so personal, I had to talk to him privately. When I asked him if he was okay, he simply said, "Sometimes knowing the truth doesn't help. Sometimes it makes things worse." Sarah's throat tightened. Thomas had lived with survivor's guilt, along with the knowledge that his efforts to save the rest of his family could not prevent the deaths of his father and oldest brother. Harold pulled out a photograph from the 1913 yearbook. Thomas stood in the back row, taller than his classmates, his face stern, his eyes distant. Not a smile like someone who had spent a decade in a teenager's body. Thomas's death was listed as an accidental drowning, but Harold gently revealed there were rumors among the teachers. The then headmaster wrote privately to the Board of Governors expressing doubts. Sarah read the letter, dated March 1914. "It is with deep sadness that I announce the death of Thomas Whitmore, one of our most promising pupils. The official report says accidental drowning, but I must express my concern. Thomas has become increasingly withdrawn of late. He asked the school priest disturbing questions about God's forgiveness and whether children are responsible for the sins of their parents. The river where he was found was not his usual route home. I fear this was no accident, but the tragic end of a young man unable to escape the haunting ghosts." Sarah quickly wiped away her tears. Thomas was a child forced to make an impossible choice. He was incredibly brave and spent the rest of his short life punishing himself for not being able to save them all. Sarah's research quickly attracted attention. One evening, she received an email from former Hartford detective Robert Martinez. He had seen her post on the local history forum and said he had information about the Whitmore case that had never been made public. They met at a small diner. Robert was in his 70s, sharp-eyed, carrying an old leather notebook. "My great-grandfather was a police officer named Patrick O'Brien," he explained. He was one of the officers who responded on June 22, 1906. He kept a personal diary, not an official record, but a record of his own observations about the cases that haunted him. The Whitmore case haunted him until the day he died. He opened the notebook, revealing faded pages. June 22, 1906. Arrived at Whitmore House at dawn. Found 2 men dead, Robert and James. Scene made to look like a struggle between father and son, leading to both firing shots. But something was wrong. Robert's revolver was near the body, but only 2 rounds had gone off. There should have been 6. Where were the other 4? June 23, 1906. Interviewed the family. Mrs. Whitmore was shocked, kept saying he protected us. The child was taken away before I could speak to him in detail. Thomas Whitmore was found the next morning sitting in the garden where the family photograph had been taken 3 days before. He held the bullet, refusing to let go. June 25, 1906. The case will be closed, though I object. The sheriff says it is a family tragedy. The father is insane. The son tried to stop him. Both died. But I don't believe it. I think Robert Whitmore had planned something worse than the murder of his husband and children. I think he intended to kill the whole family. And I think perhaps the boy with the bullet interfered in a way we shall never fully understand. June 30th, 1906. I visited Thomas Whitmore against orders. The boy said nothing but showed me the bullet still in his hand. Then he held out his hands for me to see. Small hands with marks on his fingers where he had struggled to turn the cylinder of a revolver that was too big for him. He had emptied the revolver, saving his family, but he could not empty the second revolver his father had hidden. That boy was a hero, and he would never be recognized. He would have to carry that burden alone for the rest of his life, and no one would ever know what he had done. Sarah's vision blurred at the sight. Police O'Brien had learned the truth in 1906, but the case had been hushed up to protect the Whitmore family's reputation and to spare the surviving children further pain. Robert Martinez closed the notebook, saying that Sarah's great-grandfather had never forgiven the agency for closing the case. He wrote that Thomas Whitmore was the bravest child he had ever met, who had saved 5 lives but would never be recognized, because acknowledging what he had done meant acknowledging what his father intended. Sarah spent the week writing a full report telling the story of Thomas Whitmore. But she felt there was one last piece of the puzzle, something that would tie it all together, explain why Thomas had hidden the bullet in the family photo. She returned to the photo, examining each detail with new eyes. Then she saw what she had missed. In the background, dimly visible through the window of the house, there was a silhouette standing in what appeared to be Robert's study. Sarah increased the contrast and sharpness of that area until the silhouette became clear. Robert Whitmore standing at his desk, and on the desk, the revolver was clearly visible. The photo not only captured Thomas holding the bullet, it also proved that the weapon had been in the house just 3 days before the tragedy. But more than that, Sarah noticed that Thomas wasn't looking directly into the camera like the rest of the family. His gaze was slightly to the side, toward the window where his father stood with the gun. Thomas had positioned himself deliberately. He held the bullet where the camera could see it and looked toward the study, creating a visual connection between the bullet in his hand and his father's gun. A coded message hidden in plain sight. When the photo was taken, Thomas was no longer trying to warn his family. He had already emptied the main gun. He was creating evidence for the future, an image that would prove what his father intended to do and what he had done to prevent it. It was an 8-year-old boy's attempt to record the truth in a way that couldn't be destroyed or ignored. Maybe he didn't dare speak about what he'd discovered. Maybe he was afraid of his father or thought no one would believe a child. So he left a message in the photo, hoping someone would one day understand. Sarah looked back at the image of little Thomas. No longer a victim, no longer a tragedy, but a smart and brave child who did everything in his limited power. She knew what she had to do to finally tell this story right. In September 2024, Sarah's exhibition opened at the Connecticut Historical Society, exactly 118 years after the photo was taken. She titled it, "The Boy Who Knew Thomas Whitmore and the Courage of Silence." The centerpiece was the 1906 family photo displayed in its original form, alongside enlargements showing the bullet in Thomas's hand and the gun in the window. The panels tell the full story, drawing on newspaper clippings, church records, Emily's letters, school evaluations, and O'Brien's police journal. But Sarah did more than that. She tracked down every living descendant of Thomas through Emily's family line. Jennifer Davis helped contact family members across the country, many of whom had never heard their ancestors' courageous story. On opening night, more than 50 Whitmore descendants gathered in the gallery. Sarah watched them read the story, look at the photo, and finally understand what their little relative had done. Jennifer stood before a picture of 8-year-old Thomas, tears streaming down her face. "He was just a kid," she whispered. "He saved everyone and no one ever thanked him." Sarah prepared one last piece for the exhibition. She worked with a headstone company funded by Whitmore descendants to create a new memorial headstone for Thomas in New Haven to replace the plain one that had stood for 110 years. The headstone reads, "Thomas Whitmore, 1898-1914. He saw the darkness and chose to face it. He saved his family with courage beyond his years. He bore the burden alone so others would not have to. A child who became a hero in the only way he could. Forever remembered. Forever honored." The cemetery ceremony took place the following week. Sarah stood with the Whitmore descendants as the headstone was unearthed. An older woman stepped forward, Jennifer's mother, who had heard the story from Emily. "Emily once told me she trembled. Thomas was the best of us. His heart was the purest, his conscience the strongest. He saved us, but no one outside the family knew. Promise me that when the truth is revealed, we will honor you properly." She placed a bouquet of flowers beside the new headstone, and the other members followed, adding their own touches. Sarah sat by Thomas's grave as the sun set. She thought of the boy in the photograph holding the secret evidence, trying to pass the message across time. "Someone saw," she whispered to the stone. "Finally, someone understood what you wanted to say. Your story has been told, Thomas. Rest in peace." The Whitmore family photo from June 19, 1906 is still on permanent display at the Connecticut Historical Society. Visitors come from all over to see it. It is no longer a family photo of innocence, but a testament to the courage, sacrifice, and extraordinary bravery of a boy who saved 5 lives at the cost of his innocence. Guides tell Thomas's story to school groups, explaining how he used his wit and courage to prevent a tragedy, leaving evidence in the photo that would be understood more than a century later. Sarah often returns to the photo, always stopping to look at Thomas's face. 6 months of pursuing the story has changed her understanding of bravery. Sometimes, heroic acts happen in silence. Sometimes, heroes are children doing the best they can with what they have. And sometimes, justice takes a century to come, but it finally comes. Thomas Whitmore was holding a bullet in his hand in a 1906 family photo, trying to tell a story that no one was ready to hear. in 2024, Sarah Chen finally listened. The once forgotten boy was forgotten no longer. The truth hidden in the bright, happy photo had come to light 118 years before it was revealed.